Alright, well, this might likely be the coolest video I have ever done on this channel. Why is that, you might ask? Well, it's because we're creating some medieval castles in Blender. Actually, we're creating this medieval castle in Blender. I'd like to thank Garage Farm for sponsoring this video. Garage Farm is a large cloud rendering service that makes it super cheap and easy to render any project online. They support every popular render engine available, including Blender, 3ds Max, Maya, and much more. They offer 24/7 support. Also, you get $50 free render credit when you sign up, so definitely sign up with the link in the description. Check them out, you'll definitely like it. And yeah, enjoy rendering your next scene fast and secure with Garage Farm. Also, stay tuned to the end of the video when I show you guys a quick little demo on how to render the final animation using Garage Farm. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed that little clip. It was a lot of fun to create, and we'll be creating that exact same thing in this video. Minus the dragon, that was something that I had some fun with and added at the end. That dragon model is actually available on the Blender market if you want to check it out and do some of that stuff yourself. But we're just covering the medieval castle in this tutorial. Now, I'm not going to be doing this like my standard tutorials on this channel. I'm going to be doing it a little bit more of an overview with a little bit more of a sped up video with me commentating over it, the different steps involved in creating a large scale scene like this. It's really the only possible way to cover something of this scale in a single video, so I'll be interested to know how you guys like this new format. Let me know in the comments section if you like it or not, and I'll be really interested to see what your feedback is on it. And as always, the finished scene here will be available on my Patreon page for just $3, and all active Patreons will get the blend available immediately. So thank you very much for your support and enjoy the new file. And if you're interested in getting the file yourself, like I said, it's just $3 on the Patreon page, and you get access to that blend and all the other blends on the channel. This video was actually requested by a Patreon member, Devin King, a while back, and I finally got around to doing it, so I'm really excited for it. And thank you so much, Devin, for supporting me and requesting this tutorial. Here it is, and I hope you like it. Okay, so on a larger project like this, I tend to like to start from the ground up, and so we're literally starting from the ground up, and we're building our little landscape. This is just a very low poly, triangular shape that I'm making by extruding the default cube out a bit. And the reason for this is I wanted to keep it very simple so it's easy to unwrap. So I'm just going to put a few edge cuts in this then and make it so we have some even geometry across our mesh. Then I'm going to put a very simple seam right across the back by Control-ing and marking a seam. This is for unwrapping. And after we do that, it will be very easy to just grab the top, unwrap it, the bottom unwrap it, and then the edges and unwrap it. So here I'm going to show you guys how to quick do the unwrapping, because I found that it's easier to unwrap it before we do any sculpting. So I'll create just a basic UV grid here, and then I'm going to grab all of the top faces, as you can see here, and unwrap them, do the same thing for the bottom, and then for the edges, it's really simple. All you have to do is Alt, select the whole edge, unwrap it, and you're good to go. So I do that right here, and then the last thing, but not least, is to scale all of your UV maps up quite a bit, as this is an island and not just a rock or something, so we need to have some large UV maps, as we'll be repeating some textures across that later. So that's it for the ground for now, and it's time to do a little bit of sculpting. So I'm going to go ahead and add a multi-resolution modifier. I did about 4 divisions on it, and then I just do some really terrible sculpting. I'm going to be honest with you guys, I am not very great at sculpting. But luckily for a project like this, you don't even realize. I mean, it's nature, and nature is weird sometimes, so it could be considered realistic, I guess. But I basically just use a stroke with a simple curve, as you can see here, and then I just kind of shaped out some rocky hills, basically making it just look like an organic mesh. And then I had some rock textures that I was opening up to use for some extra displacement. So these are from CG Textures, and you guys can grab them. There should be a link in the description, if I remember. But I'm just opening up some of these textures. So just using the sculpt brush and the smooth brush with a few textures here, just to kind of get an organic look. I'm not great at this, as you can tell, but luckily for a scene like this, you don't really need to be a master sculptor. That's what kind of makes it cool. You can just be subpar at best, and you can get some decent looking results. So I just went around and gave it some bumping, a little bit of rocky ground, you know, where you can have some rock showing, and you get something like this. Basically, you just want some rocky ground. And that's all you need. The micro displacements will take it from there, and it'll look great. So with that said and done though, it's time to create some assets for our castle. So for this, I start with just a basic circle, and I gave it about 8 vertices, and I'm just going to extrude up a small tower. First, I'm going to delete 3 sides and use a mirror modifier to connect it, so all I have to work on is basically a third of it, and then I can just extrude it up, put a few edge cuts, scale it in, and make kind of a simple little tower. Basically, this is the best way to go about creating something like a castle, not just trying to create a castle on itself, but by creating little assets, breaking it down, and creating some assets that you can use across your scene. So here I just insetted a little bit of a window, and I'm duplicating the bottom face, scaling it up, and what I'm going to use then is the spin modifier. Not the spin modifier, but the spin tool, I'm sorry. So I can extrude it up here, put my cursor dead center in that window, and then spin it at a whole 180 degrees, and it goes all around nicely. Give it about 9 steps or 7 steps or so in the toolbar there, and you can see you have a nice sort of low poly medieval window shape out of that. So then at the bottom there, you can just bridge those 2 gaps together by Control W and bridging them. Give it a little bit of thickness, and you're golden. Just kind of pull the edges in so you don't see where it lines up to the window, and you have a nice little medieval window. So that's really quick and easy, and yeah, just a little tip for you guys if you're creating some medieval assets. So I'll go ahead and just add another window here and a little bit of detail. So the more kind of details you can pour into these assets, the better, because you will be, like I said, duplicating some of these assets across your castle. So instead of creating an entire castle from scratch, you create a few small assets and then you duplicate those assets across. So I'm just doing the same thing here with the spin tool and the cursor right in the center of my window to spin it around, giving a little bit of thickness on that bottom window plate. And yeah, it kind of gives you a nice little medieval-like window, as you can see there. So with that said and done, just going to do a little bit of repositioning and a little bit more details and add a little bit of a top to this this asset, and that will be it for the first asset. So this is what I did on a variety of assets, I should say, and you might have noticed a little bit of repetitiveness maybe in the scene, but all in all, you end up really not standing out because there's enough details in the scene to kind of hide that there are some repeating assets. So here I'm just kind of extruding up the bricks you see around the top of a castle or a castle wall, like you might see on top of a tower, and this just gives it that classic sort of medieval castle look that I think looks pretty cool, even though it's not necessarily the way most castles are. It's pretty cool looking, and a lot of castles do it. And I'd also like to point out again how helpful the mirror modifier is here. I'm only working on 1/4 of the mesh, and it's doing it for all the other sides. So pretty much anytime you realize that you can use the mirror modifier because everything else will be the same, definitely do it. It's a huge time saver. But I'm just duplicating these out, rotating them around, and creating a basic little castle tower. So there's our first asset, just adding in a little bit of details here and there, extruding out parts, insetting parts, and so here I went ahead and created a variety of assets, really not that many though, about a half a dozen is pretty much all you need, a few different tower tops, a few different towers, and a few different types of walls. And that's really all you need to kind of spread them out across your scene and create a castle. But here I'm going to go and create a little asset for the village that you see attached to the castle. Attached! My voice. So I'm just kind of extruding up a cube here, adding a few edge loops where I want to put windows and doors in this cube, and then you can just grab that face, extrude it in, and delete the face, and you get the result of a little door and a little window. So that's all I do is I make a few edge loops where I want to place a window or door, and then I can extrude it in and delete that face. Same thing here as you can see for the roof, just extruding up a plane and making it a little bit more detailed. But that's pretty much all you need to do. You have a really basic village building. These are going to be small from a distance, and just adding those little bit of details can add that bit of realism. But here you can see I finished up with a few variations, basically just duplicating it and adding a few little changes to it, adding a little bit of dormers on some of them, a few extra windows, a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, but essentially all very basic. And these are going to be used in a particle system to give the effect of a little town village attached to the castle. So before I start duplicating these buildings, I like to add a texture to them. And so you need a texture, and for the texture I'm going to use Texture Haven. Texture Haven is actually a new website put out by Rob Turrell. I'm sorry if I just botched your name, but really some awesome resources here. This is a really great website. He's doing it all for free, just going on donations, and he has a Patreon up if you guys want to support him, but he has all kinds of really cool medieval textures. So lots of bricks, cobblestone, everything you need to create some cool castles, and this comes with all the normal maps, the bump maps, diffuse maps. So really awesome. Just go ahead and download whatever textures you think look pretty cool off this site. Download all of them. And I also used CG Textures here, or now it's textures.com, to get some PBR materials. This is where I get the rock material for the ground, as well as some more medieval textures. There's some roofing tiles that are pretty cool for the tops of those little buildings and stuff. So go ahead and download all the PBR materials you want or need for your scene. Get a bit of variation, and you'll be ready to go ahead and throw some basic materials on these objects before we start duplicating them into our scene. So here I'm going to show you guys how to texture one of our basic assets really quick using these textures. So basically just do a smart UV project on your map, select it all, and smart UV project. That's really all you need for a distant asset like this. And then I'm just going to touch it up a little bit later if I see any errors. But now I'm going to add in the principal shader. We'll connect that up, and then you can locate the textures you downloaded, and you can just drag and drop them right into your node editor. Grab the AO, the diffuse, the roughness, all that, and then just connect the diffuse to the base color of your principal shader, the roughness to the roughness slot, and for the AO, it's a basic multiply node over the color texture, and basically everything that's not the diffuse should be switched to non-color data, and then you can just go ahead and multiply the AO to the diffuse, connect the roughness to the roughness, the specular to the specular, and then for the normal map, you create a normal map node, add it to the color, and then add it to your principal shader. That's basically it. You can see here that our texture is obviously very large, so to tweak that, I'll do it in a minute if you give me a second. Jeez, don't be so pushy. Pretty simple stuff, connecting the specular to the specular principal shader as well, and you can see we have a really nice looking material. Here I'm just rotating my UV unwrap, as sometimes the UV projection doesn't have the right rotation. And then you can just kind of correct any little areas like the side bricks here that were a little bit crooked. And you can see it looks pretty great, especially from a distance. You won't see any errors. So now it's time to start the main sort of cathedral aspect of our castle. So you have your surrounding towers, and then you have this sort of center cathedral tower. And I'm just using a basic circle, extruding it up into a cylinder, and then adding a little bit of detail by scaling along the Shift Z, so I'm only scaling inwards, and then adding little bits of detail that you might see in sort of a tower slash pillar on one of these cathedrals. Basically just adding a few edge loops, extruding them out, extruding them in, doing some variation, coming up with whatever you can think of, using some images as reference, adding kind of a cool little peak on the top of this, and that's basically it. Doing some extruding, and then I can move it off to the center. Train wreck! What I do here then is I go into edit mode and I move the tower off the origin point, keeping the origin point in the center of my scene. Then I can add a mirror modifier and an array modifier, and it adds it to both sides just like I want it. So using that same method, I'm adding a cube here, just extruding it up and doing some of the same details we did on our little tower earlier, adding some edge loops and extruding out some tall cathedral-like doors, and then using the array modifier to paste it along the wall, and then using the mirror modifier to project it onto the other side of our building. So as long as your cursor and your origin point are at the center of your scene, you'll be able to repeat that over on the other side. Piece of cake. Now I'm going to go ahead and add in a foundation for our little cathedral here. I'm going to add some edge loops and then use the proportional editing tool to kind of pull out a curved edge, and do the same thing to mirror it onto the other side like I was talking about. And then you can just duplicate that foundation and basically make it a cathedral cake by going up and making extra levels to it. So up here I'm going to create a new kind of pillar, basically using the same process I did to create the other pillars, just extruding up and giving it a few edge loops to make it look a little bit more medievally. Medievally? I guess that's not really a word, but I just made it one. So now I'll just go ahead and grab one of those, duplicate it, and remove the array modifiers from it, and then just duplicate a few by hand to place them in here and there where the array modifier won't work. So just to give it kind of that wrapping look, and then we go up another layer on our cathedral cake. extruding it in and extruding it down, giving it a little bit of a thickness, making it look like there's sort of a an inside to this building, basically, giving it some walls, and then, of course, another layer, because you can keep going layers and layers, and it just keeps looking better and better. Trust me. So at this point, we need to put a little bit of a roof on our cathedral. So I'm just going to add a plane, cut it down the middle, mirror it on the other side like I've been doing. And then this is super simple. We're just going to grab that edge, pull it down to give it the angle, and then we can go ahead and pull it out on either end, making it reach as far as we need to. And then for the corners, I just extruded it one more time, and then you pull that vertice back, extrude a vertice over, and make a triangular face for another little angle to our roof. And that's basically it. A really simple cathedral. I'm going to grab one of these towers here and give it a little bit more detail by putting a few more of those in front, just like I did the pillars. And then I'm going to go ahead and create just a very simple door shape in the middle here by adding a face, extruding it up and around, and using the mirror modifier. So really basic stuff, just like the little tower I created earlier. Just creating a simple little doorway in a plane, something that you might see from a distance but doesn't have to hold up to a close shot at all. So something like that is really all you need. And that's pretty much it for our cathedral. Just adding a few more pillars. This is where you guys can be creative and create anything you want. Alright, and that's it. Now it's time to make our island floating. But what I mean by that is by adding some water around the island. I didn't do that earlier, so I'm going to do that now. Just adding a basic cube, scaling it up, and placing it right about the right point where it looks like it's a good height for the island. Making it very large because this is going to be an ocean extending for quite a ways. And then I'm going to go ahead and add a few little rocks in our landscape, because what I'm going to do in a second is I'm going to use some dynamic paint, and I'm going to make these rocks paint our ocean a little bit to give it some of that white cap effect that you might have noticed in the finished render. It adds a lot of realism to the scene though, and is really easy, so I went ahead and did this. You basically sculpt a few basic rocks using the same techniques that I did on the landscape, and then we're going to go ahead and add that dynamic paint. So we first grab our landscape, and we give it a dynamic paint option right there. We're going to give it a brush, and we're going to make that brush be completely white. We're going to paint source from the mesh volume and proximity. And then the paint distance I set to 8. That's all you have to do. Now we go on to our ocean scene, and we have to give that a quick unwrap for the dynamic paint to work. And then I just choose dynamic paint, make it an image sequence, start and end at 1 because it's not going to be animated. Give it a high resolution of about 1024. Give it an initial color of black, and then all we have to do is basically choose an output where we want our image to be saved, and name it whatever you want. Give it that UV map and bake it. After baking, you'll see we have this. And this gives us a nice, basically a white stroke around our island to work as a mask, essentially, in our materials to give ourselves some of that white cap effect where the water is hitting the island. It looks really cool. So now for our ocean material, I'm actually going to grab the ocean material that I created in my beach waves tutorial, part 2 of 2. Right around 10.5 minutes is where I create this material if you guys want to follow along exactly. There might be an annotation on the screen if I remember. But otherwise, if you created that material already, you can just go append like I am here, grabbing that same tutorial file, and then you go to the materials, and then just select the ocean shader that you created, and you'll have all your work already there for you. Now, if you didn't create it, like I said, the tutorial is there for you, and you can go ahead and create it. But otherwise, just select the ocean material, and you're good to go. So let's go ahead and add that beach splashing white cap wave to our ocean material. So here I have our basic ocean material. I'm just going to give myself a little bit of room to play with here, and then I'm going to add in that image texture that we just rendered out of Blender, the paint map. I'm going to connect this to a color ramp node to give ourselves a little bit more control over it. And then if I take a look at what we're looking at here, you should be able to see that it's looking pretty much like this. So now to add detail to that white map, we're just going to go ahead and add a noise texture, duplicate that color ramp, and give it a scale of about 500. So we have a whole bunch of really little detailed wrinkles, and we'll use that for those waves. So I'm just going to take that, and I'm going to multiply it over our white wave texture, and you can see we have the texture over our white wave. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another color ramp using that same sort of wave, and we're going to make it much smaller. I'm going to condense the blacks so we kind of scale back the white, and then use a screen node to add it back over. And now you can see that we kind of have the white foam and then the ripples leading up to it. Very basic, but from a distance, this gives a really nice look of water. So you can see a few color ramp nodes, and now I'm just going to go ahead and add a add node, put it right over our color, right before the glass shader and the transparent shader, and you can see it looks like this. So now I'm just going to go ahead and make a few tweaks to make our ocean material look a little bit deeper, and to do that I'm going to just adjust a few of the nodes that I have already set up here. I'm going to take the power node up to about a 1.2 or down in case depending on what you had it set to, and then the multiply value to about a -0.9. This will just make it look a little bit deeper. And same thing with the minimum node, I changed that to 2.2. So this just gives it a little bit of a deeper look, and you can see that our ocean shader is looking pretty nice now. We have that white water kind of showing up nicely. So now it's time to add some more displacement to our water. So I already have a noise texture here. I'm just going to take it and I'm going to give it 120 or 12,000 I should say, scale, 5 detail, and a little bit of distortion. I found gives a little bit more of a wave look. And then you can connect a color ramp to adjust it, duplicate it, and now we'll create a little bit of a larger wave. This will only be 250, and it'll be another color ramp node, and a little bit less detail, but a little bit more distortion for even more of that wave effect. We can kind of tighten up the black on that color ramp node as well. Then I like to just add some math multiply nodes to the end of those color ramps to kind of control the intensity, and then a mix screen node to connect two of them together. And you can see that when we screen the bigger waves over the smaller waves, we get some nice details between the waves with some smaller ripples. Now I'm just going to create one very large noise texture. I'm giving this just a scale of like 10 or 12 and a little bit of distortion but not much detail, and a color ramp node to kind of crush the blacks a little bit. And then if you multiply this over your node, you can see that you give only areas of your ocean waves. And this is what I want to do because I don't want everything to be waves. You want to kind of have some calmer sections and some more detailed wavy sections of your ocean. And this is how you do it with a very large noise texture. Now the last thing to do to kind of make those ripples look a little bit better is I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the multiply node once here and multiply the small ripples on top of it again. Actually, the small ripples go on top, the big ones on bottom. And you get an effect like this, where it gives you a much nicer, finer looking wave texture. One more multiply node to control the intensity. You can see you can make it really intense if you want, but that's essentially it. You have a nice ocean shader with a ton of control, and you can tweak it however you like. So now I'm going to add a screen node, and what I'm going to do is I actually take the white water texture and connect it in the bottom, and you can see that that gives it a ton of bump, which is way too much, but just a very little bit of this gives those white waves a little bit of a raised effect, which I thought just gave it just a little bit more realism. Alright, and now that we have a cool looking ocean material, it's time for a cool looking rock ground material for our island. So to do this, it's time for some micro displacements. I'm going to first drop in a principled shader for this material, and then we need to do a few settings for the micro displacements. One, we need to add a subdivision surface modifier and make sure adaptive sampling is on. Dicing rate of 1 will work for now. And then you need to go to your material settings, and under the displacement, choose both. This is for 2.79 right now, and that is what you have to do. And then we get our rock textures. Now this is a rock texture off textures.com. There should be a link in the description, otherwise you can probably find it. It's just a basic rock texture, but it has a really cool height map. So that is what I'm going to do for this. I'm going to use the height map to control the displacement. So here's just the basic material with the AO applied. Now I'm going to open the height map, and if I connect it to the displacement, you should see, give it a second, or a few, that we have some micro displacements showing up. We have the rock texture repeated across our whole scene, giving it some cool bump. That's cool, but I would like it to be only in the corners where there's sharper edges of our scene. And that's what I'm going to use the pointiness material for. You can see here I just added the geometry node. I'm connecting it to a color ramp to kind of narrow it down to just the corners of the mesh using the pointiness option like I said. And then we're going to use that multiplied over our color to make it so it's only putting the bump in the corners. This kind of gives yourself some smoother areas and some sharper rock areas, and this is really cool to kind of control the micro displacement. I've really been using the pointiness geometry node quite a bit, and it's really helped. So now you can use a multiply math node again to control the intensity of this. And if we take a look, we have our rock shader looking pretty good already right off the bat with just a little bit of a node. So now it's time to add a little bit of grass in between those rocks. So again, just a few textures from textures.com. I'm going to grab some grassy textures and some rocky textures. I'm going to use a mix node, and then we're going to add in, let me quick grab the rock here. There we go. Then I'm going to add a noise texture to combine these two textures together, basically to give it a little bit of variation. And I also like to use some hue saturation values just to kind of tweak the color of these textures. But a noise texture, of course, the color ramp to adjust the noise texture as well. Give it a scale of like 50 or so. Connect it to a UV coordinate node, so we're using the UV coordinates. And then, yeah, just kind of tweak it down to about what you want. Actually, I'm leaving that as a 5 scale. And then, yeah, if it's the factor of the mix node, you get a nice little grassy / rocky texture. And we're going to use this in between our rocks. So basically, I'm going to use that same pointiness factor coming off our geometry node to control which areas are grassy and which areas are rocky. So using that as a factor of a mix node, we just have to flip those inputs real quick, and we can see that if we multiply it to make it more intense, we have the rock on the edges and the grass on the inside. Again, an easy way to create kind of a procedural texture node ground for our island, and you can see that it gives yourself or myself, anyone's self, some good looking results. So now you can see the bump is a little weak, and I just need to crank up the multiply node a little bit. So now I'm just going through and kind of tweaking the color ramp, adding a little bit more detail to our color ramp to kind of control how much rock I want to see and how much grass I want to see. Once you do that and you're satisfied with the amount, you can add a bump node. And then with this bump node, we're going to take a little bit of the texture of the grass and rock that we used and plug that into a color ramp, and then plug that into the strength of the bump node. So as well as getting the displacement from the rocks, our grass is also giving our scene a little bit of displacement. So pretty simple, just connecting that with a color ramp here into the bump node height, and then turning the strength up to about 1. And you can see that if we crank the blacks up a little bit, we get a little bit of that detail in the grass. It just adds another little layer of realism to your scene, so you might as well do it. And that's looking pretty not bad, if you ask me. Alright, now I just go ahead and add in one more texture, and that is the roughness texture to our rocks, and have that control the roughness of our principled shader. It gives us just a little bit more realism to the specular highlights. And then I'm going to go ahead and I believe I tweak the colors a little bit for the grass here. So I just go ahead here and tweak the hue and saturation values a little bit to kind of find something that I think matches the rest of the colors of the rock nicely. Alright, so now it's time to add the walls to our island. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my little wall mesh here, and I'm going to make sure the origin point is in the bottom left corner of the mesh. As you can see right there, I'm going to go ahead and put the cursor there as well, and then add a curve path. This is going to allow me to add a modifier now to our wall, an array modifier that is, and then a curve modifier as well. So now in your curve settings, you're just going to grab that new curve that you just added, and then in your array settings, you're going to change the fit type to fit curve, choose that curve that you just added as well. And now if you grab the curve, you'll see when you go ahead and move the curve around or extrude it, that the castle wall will follow it exactly. So this is really easy for adding all kinds of walls to your scene. You can kind of make it go up and down valleys and around hills and stuff. It's really cool, and it saves a whole bunch of time on modeling the walls. So this is where modifiers can be super, super powerful. I go ahead and add a subdivision surface modifier on simple as well, and that's more for the materials later on, but you can go ahead and do that as well, and you're ready to start adding curves to your island. So here we're going to take the island, put the curve on it, and then just start extruding the curve around, adding walls everywhere we extrude that curve. So it's really easy, and I just like to kind of have fun with this and make the walls go wherever you want. I don't really know what to say. It's kind of fun to watch though. You can extrude the path of the curve around, I guess. You don't have to. You can if you want to. I'm not making you do anything, but that's what I did. And I thought it looked pretty cool. Just saying. Whew. Okay, I've been doing this too long. I need a break. But isn't this cool? Isn't this path that I'm making cool? Aren't you having fun watching this? And yeah, it's really easy to get an organic looking sort of flowing wall, like the Great Wall of China, for example, around your scene. Trust me, it's cool. And it was fun. It was fun. You should try it yourself. And now it's time for the most exciting part. It's adding the assets to our landscape and environment. So I first start by putting that cathedral that we created, that we had some fun with. and just drop that into basically where you want the heart of your castle to be. So this is kind of the center of the castle. The walls then will go around it. So if I turn on the walls here, you can see that we have our walls. All right, so now it's time with the walls and the cathedral in our scene to start adding some of those towers that we created earlier and some of those other assets. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the tower that I created, and instead of duplicating it, I'm going to Alt-D it. This creates an instance, and it means that whenever you change the geometry later on, it will change them for all of them. So I'm just going to go ahead and use this with an array modifier to make it a little bit taller and scale it and basically place it wherever I want, where I feel like a tower might look kind of cool. Just kind of picking cool locations now to drop in a new tower, giving them different heights, different scales, different widths, and different rotations. And now that we have a few towers like this, I'm going to go ahead and grab that little castle top tower that I created earlier, Alt-D it, move it into our main scene, and then grab the tower, put the cursor at the top, grab our little castle top tower thing, and go Shift-S, selection to cursor. And then just kind of fix the rotation, and you can see it looks pretty cool. So here's the scene now with many little towers added, both the different variations I had, and yeah, it looks pretty cool. And this is basically using 4 or 5, I would say, different assets, basically using towers and the little tower tops. And I made 2 different variations of the tower tops, the kind of the brick one and then the roof kind of peak ceiling, as you can see there. And now I'm just duplicating them, putting them on top of the towers that I duplicated earlier, and giving them some variation in the scale and rotation. Really simple stuff, but adding a lot of them and kind of mixing up the rotation and stuff, and you really don't see the repetitiveness of what it actually is. And it saves a ton of time on building a massive project like this. And now that we have the assets sort of distributed across our scene, I'm going to enable Node Wrangler in the add-ons and start adding in some more details to our materials. So to do this, I'm basically starting with the basic rock texture or brick texture that you saw me put together earlier, and just kind of tweaking the texture's color a little bit with the hue saturation value node. And what I'm going to end up doing is basically create 2 materials identical to each other with different textures. As you can see down here, I have a texture the exact same, just using a green brick, and I'm going to mix these together using a mix shader. So we have 2 principled shaders with the corresponding textures connected, and we'll be mixing these together using the geometry node as a factor, again with the pointiness value, and then adding a simple subdivision surface modifier and changing it to simple, giving it about 2 levels, can give you even more control over the pointiness node in the node options here. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a noise texture, another color ramp, and then add crush the blacks and whites a little bit, and then I can take, whoops, bumped my mic. Then I can take the pointiness value and kind of screen it over this noise texture to give ourselves a nice sort of mask to combine both of those materials together. So by screening that into the bottom, changing the value to 1 of course, and messing around with the color a little bit, you can see we have a nice mask. And if I use a mix shader now, I can have that mix the bottom material with the top material, using that as a factor. So once I do that, and if I throw a multiply node in there to control the intensity again, if I just take a look at it here, you can see that we have the green texture coming through on top of our brick texture. So it's really cool, and you can kind of tweak the color ramps a little bit to get just the same right amount of green texture showing through. But again, it's a procedural way to kind of add realistic variations, I should say, to your material in the material node editor. Just using that multiply node as the intensity, and it looks very nice. So the last bit of detail now that I wanted to add to my little tower top here is some streaks. Usually you have some dirty streaks leaking from bricks or whatever. So for what I did is I got some leaking textures from textures.com. I threw it in with a mapping node in a texture coordinate so I can control exactly where I place this leaking texture over my object. So I can use the mapping node now to get the texture lined up exactly where I want it underneath the windows. And then it's just simply putting in a math node, changing it to multiply again so I can control the intensity of it, and then duplicating our RGB mix node, changing it to multiply, and then multiplying black with this being the factor. So if this is the factor, you can just change your multiply node now and make it more or less dark streaks. And you can see here, combined with the original, you get that really cool streaking effect. This is pretty much exactly the same material I also used on the walls around the perimeter of the castle to give us sort of that realistic, sort of worn-in looking material. And now it's time to start lighting and rendering our scene. So I haven't showed it yet, so I'll show it now. I'm going to quick open up an HDR image from HDR Haven, a pretty cool looking kind of rocky cliff looking HDR that I found looked very nice. I'll link to it in the description if I remember. And then I'm going to add the typical texture coordinate and mapping node and spin it around on the Z rotation until I get some nice clouds in the background of my scene. For me, it was 1157 that worked. Actually, that is a lot more complicated than it has to be, but that's what it was. Then just tweaking the location a little bit to get the clouds exactly where I wanted them in the background of my scene. And that's it for the positioning. I cranked the strength up to 2 on our background scene, and then I added an RGB curves node to kind of control the colors of our environment a little bit. I wanted to give the sky a little bit more of an evening reddish hue, so just by messing around with the red, blue, and green channels on our RGB curves, I got a pretty nice looking red hue to our environment, which kind of changes the overall lighting a bit too, and it just makes it look a little bit more like an evening red sky, and that was what I was looking for. So you can see that looks pretty good. And then it was time to drop a camera in my scene, so I just added a camera. Of course, everything is really large now though, so I have to get the rotation right and then adjust the clipping so I can actually see my island. So change the clipping to about 2000 and then it works beautifully. And then I changed the focal length to about 32 millimeters, enabled limits, and set the distance to be focused right on the center of our island by changing the distance in the depth of field settings. You want to enable the mist display, and then over in our render layers, we're going to go ahead and we're going to enable mist, we're going to enable AO, and then I'm going to enable the environment and the glossy passes. So these passes are going to be really handy to add a little bit of extra realism in the compositor later. So go ahead and do that. And then you can jump over to your world settings and adjust the mist values to go from the start of your scene basically to the end, the last object of your scene. And this will give us a lot of control over the mist again in the compositor. So now I added some little detail. So I just used some of the simple fern assets that I created for the realistic nature asset pack, put those into a particle system as you can see here, just using about 1500 of them, and using a weight paint to put them in the right location. Some simple settings, emitting them along the Z location, and giving a little bit of random scale, and that's about it. So you guys can go ahead and create these assets yourself if you'd like. I have some tutorials on CG Geek for how to do this. Otherwise, you could also buy them with the Realistic Nature Asset Pack and get them for just 10 bucks. Here I also have some trees added into the scene, and again, you can either buy the asset pack and get them for 10 bucks, or you can create them yourself using the tutorial I have here on how to create trees. So it's your option. I don't like to force anyone to buy anything, so I like to give the training for it, and then also the option to purchase it if you want to support me and get the asset just a little bit quicker. So now it's time to add our little village. So I'm going to grab those assets that you just saw, and I'm going to add a plane onto our landscape. I'm going to scale it up, and then I'm going to subdivide it a few times. The reason I'm subdividing it is because everywhere there's a vertice, I'm going to be adding a building. So just using the proportional editing tool here to kind of match the terrain of the ground, I add a particle system. I give it just as many particles as there are vertices. You can see if I tab into edit mode, while I'm on there, I have 81 vertices. So I give it 81 particles, and there'll be a particle for every vertice. So then to emit a building everywhere we have a vertice on our particle system, you're going to want to change the emission type. First you choose advanced, then you're going to choose emit from vertices, and then disable any randomizing options. If you do that, you'll have a hair strand for every single vertice, and then you can go ahead and open up your group and put those buildings in there. So make sure that you group together all of your buildings. Just grab them all, Alt-G, and name them houses. You can misspell it if you want. And then go ahead and grab the group, grab that group that you just made, and you see we have a building on every little house. If you choose rotation, they'll be at the right rotation, and then you can go ahead and change the size, change the scale, and then if you grab the rotation setting there as well, you can change the rotation. Very simple stuff, but yeah, this is a way to create an elaborate looking city with just a few particles and a few simple structures. So now you can go ahead and extrude this mesh out wherever you want, and every time you tap out of edit mode, the particle system will update with more buildings everywhere you put new vertices. So it's really cool. It's kind of a way to build your little village out and extend it however you feel looks creatively cool. And yeah, it worked really well for me. Especially since it's a distance shot and you don't have to worry about anything too close up. And you can see we have a nice little village here. If I switch to rendered view for you guys, you can see that it looks very cool. You just want to uncheck the emitter in the particle settings there to make it so the buildings are sitting on the ground. So now for the final bit of detail, I added some vines to our towers and to our walls. This is done with just a simple particle system with a weight paint group. Adding the particle system, you can check the use modifier stack if you're using array modifiers on these towers to add the particles all the way up the tower. And then just a simple leaf is all I used. Here you can see it's a very simple mesh rendered with just a very basic leaf texture. And the material is ultra simple, a principled shader with the texture connected to it. But it's little details like this that really added a lot to this finished scene, something that you don't notice right off the bat, but when you look for it, you start to see more of the details. So you can go ahead and add this particle system to any of the objects in your scene that you like, and it just adds that little bit of extra realism. Just keep in mind that the more particles you render, the slower the render will be by a little bit. And then the last detail to add before we finish our scene is some distant landscape. So for this, I just used the landscape add-on. You can go ahead and enable the Ant landscape add-on in the add-ons, and then go Shift A, add in a landscape, pull up your toolbar and your settings, and then you just want to change the mesh X and Y to be very large, and along with that you're going to have to make the noise scale quite a bit bigger, and that is also including the height and the minimum height in the settings. So I'm not going to go through all of these settings, but basically I just created a very large mesh using the landscape generator add-on. And I found that using the noise pattern of Slick Rock looked really cool for this. And really basic though, just kind of experiment with the depth, the noise size, and the height. And that's pretty much all you have to do. I also just took the subdivisions down to 64, as this doesn't have to be super high quality. And yeah, just make the noise size about as tall as you want your distant mountains to be, and making sure the minimum is set to allow the noise to go that high, essentially. So after I was happy with my noise pattern, after playing around with the settings a little bit, I went ahead and increased the scale along the x-axis. So I have a long and narrow sort of mountain range landscape that you could say. And then you can play around with the settings a little bit more. Take the resolution down to about 64 is what I did, I think, because it doesn't have to be high quality at all. It's going to be very distant. And then just kind of play around with the settings until you find something that you're happy with. There's lots of little settings that you can mess around with. But overall, it's really straightforward, just kind of messing around with the height and the depth and the displacement of your texture, basically. I also like to change the fall off to be Y, so the mountains continue all the way to the edge of your mesh instead of sort of cutting off to a flat edge, as you can see here. So that's basically what I did. And then this mountain gets pretty much the exact same material that your Close Island material got, except even more basic. Just a simple pointiness shader with some rock and some grass. And then as you can see here, I'm just duplicating it and kind of throwing it in the background there to add to the scene. Make it seem a little bit larger scale, show that there's more ground around than just plain ocean for as far as the eye can see. Adding some distant mountains like this will add just a lot of depth to your scene. It will look really great, especially when you add the mist in the compositor in a second here. So go ahead and do that. Put some in the background, as many as you want, wherever you want, and it's time to render. After all that, it is time for a render. Drum roll please, bum bum. For this scene I found about 500 samples look good, and once you have that set, F12, and here we go. We have a pretty cool looking landscape. It really doesn't need too much compositing because it looks pretty cool right off the bat. But I always like to do a little bit of compositing. Starting with the AO that we rendered out, we're going to go ahead and add a multiply node. Put the AO in the bottom socket of the multiply node, and you can control the amount of ambient occlusion you want in your scene. You can see here that because the AO doesn't block out the background, what I'm going to do real quick is add in a color ramp node. So just creating a basic mask with the color ramp in the environment output that we selected, connecting that into the screen node, and we can get rid of the black sky. So now the AO just controls the landscape and our building. So I usually go about 0.5 or 0.6 with the amount of AO in a scene. I don't like to go 100%. And then I'm going to go ahead and work on the mist. So you connect the mist to a color ramp so you can have that little bit of extra control if you need it. So now I'm also going to use that environment mask to basically invert it and take out the mist put into the sky, essentially, because I don't want to add any mist to the background, only to our objects that we've added in Blender. So now I'm going to go ahead and mix that over our scene with a mix node. And what I found looked pretty cool is if I actually take the environment, blur it a whole bunch, and then use that as the color for our mist overlay. The reason I do this is because it gives a little bit of variation to the color of your mist overlay. Instead of just leaving a light blue color for the mist, taking your environment, blurring it a bunch, and then adding a color balance node like I did here, giving it a little bit of variation, making it very bright, but giving it a little bit of variation. You can kind of change it to the hue that you want, and that just kind of adds a more realistic environment mist, I think, because environment mist is usually sort of reflective to your actual scene. So being able to use the scene to color it like that, I think just adds a bit of realism. So you can see it's looking pretty cool after all that mist was added. So now the last step is to add a few clouds. And for this, I did the cheaty method. I just grabbed some cloud images that had an alpha mask already applied to them, found them off Google Images, I'll put a link to them, and then just import them on a plane and put that plane duplicated multiple times across my scene. You can see it's a very simple material here, just the texture with an emission texture and a mix shader and a transparent shader, using the color to mix the two of them. You can even drop a hue saturation value node in here and kind of change the colors to make them a little bit more blue, a little bit more red. So for the clouds, I then gave it its own render layer so I could kind of overlap these and control the amount of clouds in the scene in the compositor. So just a new render layer, just disable everything, even the environment, just leaving the clouds in that scene, and you can see that this is the pass you get when you render that. Because we have no environment, it looks black and white. And then we can just go ahead and mix, add them over our scene using the factor to control the amount of clouds. It just kind of gives it a bit more depth on top of the mist. And again, you can throw a color balance node then in there to kind of change the color of these clouds. So it's kind of a cheaty method. I'm not doing any crazy volumetric rendering or anything, but it's a whole lot faster. And if you just want that little touch of cloud, it's an easy way to get that sort of realism in your scene. So then the last thing I did is add a little bit of extra glossy using those glossy passes that we rendered out in the compositor. So I'm just going to add the indirect and direct glossy passes together, duplicate that node, change it to multiply, and multiply the color output underneath. This comes out a little bit noisy though, so I like to throw a despeckle node over it and just crank the threshold down to about a 0.1. Then you're just going to go ahead and add in a mix node, change it to add, and then you can add some of that glossiness in the bottom socket using the factor to control how much glossiness you add to your scene. So this is just something I've been doing recently that I'm really liking. I actually learned it from Lucas Weber when I did my beach waves tutorial. Just kind of a way to control the overall glossiness of the scene in the compositor. Now I'm going to go ahead and just throw in a glare node. I change it to fog glow, and I just crank it really low, give it about a threshold of a 0.5, make the size very small, and just a little bit of that extra glow to the scene, kind of make some of those shiny materials shine a little bit better. But that's it, guys. There is our finished castle. Alright, and like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I wanted to show you guys now how to render your finished animation out using GarageFarm. So it's really easy to create an account on GarageFarm. It doesn't require any credit card information or anything. You can get started with your $50 free render credit. And I'm just going to go ahead and log in here. And if you're using it for the first time, you're going to want to go ahead and download the little desktop app and add-on for Blender to allow you to use GarageFarm really easy right from your Blender application. Just scroll down through the add-ons until you find the Blender add-on application. Go ahead and download it for Windows in this case. If you're using a Mac, you'll obviously want to go ahead and download it for Mac. And then once your download is finished, it's a very simple install setup. You just want to run through that. And once the install is finished, it will be added to Blender. You'll just want to go ahead and reopen Blender. And then once that's done, you can jump over to Blender, go to your user preferences, switch to add-ons, and just start searching for Render Beamer. The add-on will already be added to your add-ons list. You'll just want to check the check mark to enable it. And once that's done, you'll be ready to send your project over to GarageFarm to have it rendered. You'll want to check for any last-minute changes you might want to make to your render settings or anything. Make sure you have all the layers you want rendered enabled, and then you just go to the File, Render, and down to Render Beamer and choose Beam It Up. So you send it over to the GarageFarm then, You can use the little desktop app to see the upload progress of when your scene will be arranged, and GarageFarm basically takes care of everything else. Once the upload's finished, you'll be able to jump over to your web manager again, and if you jump over to your projects tab, you'll now have the project added there. You can go ahead and click on your project, locate the blend file, and if you click on the blend file, you'll see you have a few last minute changes here that you can make to your scene before you render it. So if you want to change the resolution, the number of samples, the start and end frame range, the output path, or the file name, you can do that now. You can also even choose what version of Blender you want to render on. So for example, I chose to render with the Filmic preset already enabled and 2.79, and you also can change the priority of your render. If you set it to a high priority, it will be given top priority and be rendered as fast as possible. And if you set it to a lower priority, you'll be using a little bit of slower hardware and it'll take a little bit longer, but you'll get to save some money. So do whatever you want for that and go ahead and click submit and your project will begin rendering. Again, you'll get a little desktop notification when your project is finished rendering, and then you can just jump back to your little desktop app and download all of your finished images right there from the little Render Beamer app. If you've downloaded the images, you'll get a folder looking something like this with all of your finished frames in your animation, all ready to be stitched together and put together in a video that will look amazing. So thanks a whole lot to GarageFarm for sponsoring this video, and that's gonna do it for me, guys. So I'll catch you in the next one. Bye bye.